high savings in the Asian economies, where people have to make their own contributions also, which is why we're now setting up a national savings fund. We are now opening up opportunities for the informal sector to join the social security system, whereby we therefore encourage people to continue to save, but they get additional matching funds from the state. And this kind of welfare model, I think, would be more sustainable, because we don't want to go in and get into a situation later on like many other economies in the West have gotten themselves into, which is the inability to sustain that kind of welfare model where the state just relies solely on taxes.
Well, politics aside, if I can say something on social safety nets, I think social safety nets should be targeting the very poor and the very vulnerable, and it has to be done in a well-targeted way and using the right types of subsidy. You know, do you give cash? Do you give in kind? One of our lessons in 2005 was we reallocated the fuel subsidy, which it was said to be intended for the poor, but actually it was not benefiting the poor, and we reallocated it so that it would benefit the poor in terms of cash transfer as well as rice subsidy, for instance. And then the next layer, that's where you do more, create more opportunities, microfinancing, job creation, self-employment. So I think you have to, for addressing inequality at different levels, you have to have very different policies and be very clear on the target so that you know what needs to be done. And I would say democracy, you know, the debate that was going on here, you know, democracy is actually the best test for whether a social safety net is actually what the people want. You are not going to get elected next round if you don't really deliver to the people. And that's exactly what happened in Indonesia in the 2009 elections. People voted not based on ideology anymore. They voted on whether the politicians were delivering what was needed.
And for Prime Minister Abhisit, that democratic test is very, very close indeed.
Yes, indeed. And I've been encouraged by the responses I get when I travel up and down the country. I think the free education program, the income support for the elderly, the farmer income guarantee programs are now getting very good responses. And I think people expect more, but at the same time, we need to make sure that these programs are responsible, sustainable. And there's always a fear that people would try to just outbid each other in terms of what you would provide to the people. And therefore, you know, each society and economy goes through a learning process. And we just have to see what kind of balance we reach.
Prashant Ria, how much is there a trend towards corporate social responsibility in India? This is not a region of the world that is known for CSR, but I wonder, is that changing?
Yes, I think there's been a big change, again, in the last few years, and most of the major corporates are taking CSR very, very seriously. We have a foundation called the SR Foundation. We provide CSR around 3 themes. Entrepreneurship is one of them, education, and all around our facilities, most of our facilities are actually in the less developed states, and there is a very, very major focus on providing education and entrepreneurship to most of these people.
I know you do very good work, but I'm just wondering whether there is ever a point where, when you're active in a particular area, like I know you're particularly active in Gujarat,
right,
which is where a lot of your production base is, could it also not exacerbate inequality? Because you're probably operating in states where there are lots of opportunities already, and then when your CSR is focused on that same region, again, it leaves other parts of India behind.
And I think Gujarat, therefore, is not a very good example, because Gujarat is actually one of the states which is doing extremely well and is right up there amongst the performance amongst all the various states. And therefore, more of our activity is actually in the less developed states on the eastern part of the country, which is Jharkhand, Orissa, and those states which actually need much more CSR activity.
I'm going to come to a couple more questions from the audience. Ian Bremer. Thank you.
I'll bring a question up on that democracy test, because, you know, we know that when you implement sudden reforms, you don't just put them in place. The mentality has to be that they're going to work. We saw that in Russia with shock therapy, and the mentality wasn't there, and oligarchs took over. They don't have great governance today. In Indonesia today, we've had an extraordinary move towards democracy. To what is the mentality there sufficiently for President Netanyahu to say, I'm not going to groom, I'm not going to talk about who my leader, my successor is going to be? Or is there a significant risk that the roots aren't sufficiently entrenched? In Thailand, with a very significant upcoming elections coming. Are the generals sufficiently respectful of the significant mentality supporting democracy, and will they respect whatever outcome comes from a democratic election?
Democracy is well and alive and getting stronger every day in Indonesia, because don't forget, it's not just direct presidential election. We have direct elections all the way down to the village head. So I think Indonesians in the last 5 years have gotten used to democracy and electing people or politicians based on performance. And there's been a huge, I think, information spread there. I think that's the other component, democracy plus instant information and instant response. The fact that we have this social media, interconnecting the youth of Indonesia as well as the people of Indonesia. 38 million people in Indonesia use Facebook, 162 million people have handphones, and so on. I think similar with the other countries. So you really, in a way, you really can't lie. You have to be very transparent. And so I think I'm very hopeful that whatever happens, moving ahead from the presidential elections all the way down to the village head, that it would be a fair competition.
Prime Minister Abhisit,
if you follow the coverage of the elections, you will see that all political parties, the army and all groups are now saying that everybody, not just generals, everybody has to respect the decisions of the people on the 3rd of July.
It's not the same as believing. Did you believe that the generals, are you absolutely certain that they will respect every result? Talking about it is not the same as you believing.
There's no reason to believe that the decision would not be respected. And it is clear that all political parties have the freedom to campaign now, and they are also going to have the freedom to choose the next government once the election results are known.
Walden Bello, are you as confident about the entrenchment of democracy in this part of the world?
I hope the Prime Minister is right. I'm a bit more skeptical. I do believe that if it is the opposition that wins, I think Thailand will have problems with the generals and with the, shall I say the word here, we're in Indonesia, with the monarchy. I think there's a problem in a polity where saying something about the king gets you or lands you in jail. I don't think that lèse-majesté rules have any place in a modern polity, which is why I'm a bit skeptical. Having said that, I have to say that when it comes to my country, the Philippines, we've had formal democracy, but we lack the economic component of democracy, which has made us, despite 26 years of elections, it has made us very unequal in the country. So I think that the challenge for all of our countries is how do we move away from formal electoral democracy to real economic democracy. That's, I think, very, very central at this point in time.
Prashant Ria, so political democracy doesn't necessarily lead to economic democracy.
But again, if you think of what's happening in India in terms of democracy, I think it's a very good shining example of how the people's view and the people's verdict is final. It's been proven now over the last few decades, and I think that's something which might be the right a good example for us all to follow.
Except is it not the case that it hasn't actually lifted proportionally the same number of people out of poverty in India when you compare it to an authoritarian system in China?
Yeah,
if we're looking purely at inequality.
Yes, I think that might be true, but then you get that with a lot of other things, and in democracy the growth is slower, the decision making may be a bit slower, but at the end the people feel that people have a voice and they get what they want, and they have the right to choose if a government is not performing.
I guess you could always find exceptions to the rule, but you would have to be convinced that economic and political democracies will help support each other. If you have more economic democracy, you are likely to support a more liberal democratic regime. And vice versa, if you have political democracy, the chances are that the government that needs to respond to the majority of people will have to make sure that there is greater economic democracy also. I know this isn't a forum to discuss Thai politics, but since the professor keeps bringing this subject up, I should also point out that he's quite right in saying that political democracy has many dimensions. And when he said that the opposition, if they win, might create problems, I think it depends on what they do. If they would get on with the issue of governing for the majority of people, there would be no problem.